Ja, schönen guten Abend, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren.
Yeah, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to the second part of our introduction to hydrogen. I'm Stephanie Boll. I'm responsible for ecology and sustainability in Heinrich Boll Foundation. The second part of our introduction. Yesterday, we talked about the energy technological foundations of hydrogen. We could see that hydrogen plays a central role in climate neutral industry. It really is a game changer for climate neutrality. Mrs. Schmidt showed us how hydrogen can help us to complete the energy chain turnover. And you can see also that the hydrogen industry and economy is just at the beginning in Germany, just like everywhere in the world. There's a lot of talk about projects, but we are really at the beginning of the hydrogen epoch. And because we are at the beginning, it's important now to make sure that it will become a really green hydrogen economy without fossil fuels. We have to make sure that we go for the right colors of, and also that the value creation chain has to be an integrated one and socially, and that's what we are talking about, what the political world has to do in order to create a sustainable green hydrogen economy, what framework conditions are necessary for it in Germany and Europe. So our focus today will be on Germany and Europe, but there will also be space for an international perspective for your comments from around the world. And you can also see that in this webinar, you can listen to English translation. And for our international attendees, and you can also enter your questions in a question and answer tool at Zoom. Please don't put any questions in the chat. There's also the possibility to get involved actively in the seminar. If you do have a question via video or only audio, then please write in the question answer tool, put a V for video, and then we know that you want to join with video and audio. And so it would be nice to have some live participants. And our speaker today is Maike Schmidt again. She is the head of system analysis at the Center for Solar Energy and Hydrogen Research in Baden-Württemberg. And as I said yesterday, she's the perfect speaker for this introduction course, because she has a technical perspective, technical scientific perspective, and can also talk about the political dimension, which is what we want to do. And she's been dealing with hydrogen for a long time, much longer than most of us in this introduction course. Before I hand the floor to her, a quick survey for you, for us. So Philip, our technician, will show the questions. We want to know from you, well, where you live, first of all, what kind of residential structure it is, and what kind of connection you have to hydrogen, maybe your professional background, and or as an activist, and also how did you find out about this seminar? We have a group of questions, 4 questions that you can reply to anonymously, and it will help us for our future seminars to improve them, and also have a look at our distribution chain, and so that we can probably broadcast beyond this big city bubble, which is normally the focus of Zoom. And 15 seconds to answer the questions, and then we can get started. I believe, Philipp, that we have had enough time. Okay, you can see the results of the questions, and you can see most of the participants are in Germany. And a lot are from big cities. And the connection to hydrogen is very mixed. And the political organizations and private is almost equal. And most of you found out via email. Thanks for participating. And I hand over the floor to Mrs. Schmidt for the second part of our introduction course. Hello and good evening from my part. And I'm very happy for you that you could be here again tonight and for a second round of our introductory course. Today it's about the political framework conditions for climate-friendly hydrogen. I want to get started with a point that we also started to discuss yesterday, but not in depth. So the hydrogen and economy is not just, hasn't been popular since today. Our Center for Hydrogen Research was founded in 1988 after the oil crisis and after the Chernobyl disaster. The idea was to introduce renewable energies, solar and hydrogen. So this is the first picture, 1986, the High Solar Project with countries from the Middle East and in cooperation with Germany. And the idea was to produce hydrogen from solar energy. That didn't bear fruit. 1997, the next big wave. At the time when at a game show in Germany, it was announced that from 2002, Daimler-Benz would introduce fuel cell vehicles in series production. That also didn't bear fruit. 10 years later, on a national level, the innovation program with fuel cell technology and hydrogen, which gave a big push for research and development. And now in 2020, we have the National Hydrogen Strategy and the hydrogen strategy on a European level. And so the question is now, what's different today than in 1986? I think an essential factor today is that there is a broad social and political consensus for more climate protection, and hydrogen plays a decisive role. And also today, renewable generators are competitive with fossil and nuclear power generation. And it's also the cost-effective aspect that is in focus today. And we can also see that the private capital is also available from institutional investors. And in the framework of the political announcements of the Green Deal, the European taxonomy, and the framework conditions should enable future-proof investment and give a chance for hydrogen. So you can see the hydrogen economy is not popular since today, but a lot of things are different. And it seems that we would have a long-term strategy that we are embarking on now. How did it start? Well, Europe is to be the first climate neutral continent. This was the announcement by Ursula von der Leyen when she started in 2019. In the autumn, she announced the European Green Deal and said that she wants that Europe can achieve even more by becoming the first climate neutral continent. And in order to achieve this goal, she would propose a Green Deal. Part of it was also the first climate law, which was meant to the European climate law to enshrine in law the goal of climate neutrality by 2050, and then the plan to mobilize at least 1 trillion euros to trigger a wave of green investment. She announced this, and now we have had the first European climate protection law until 2050. And the difference of the Green Deal between the Green Deal and the previous strategies, which were introduced yesterday as well, but it's for Germany, but it's also true for Europe. In the previous European scenarios, we had a reduction, foreseen a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 80 to 95% by 1990, but the measures were oriented primarily towards 80%. Minus 80%. And under these conditions, it would have been possible also to allow industry, to allow emissions in the industry, to allow emissions in transportation and in electricity generation. Now, this with a goal of 95%, minus 95%, or climate neutrality, climate gas neutrality is no longer possible. We also have to include now the energy intensive sectors and the entire transportation sector, also goods transports, and also international maritime shipping, climate neutral electricity and process heat supply. So that therefore hydrogen is also on the political, plays a different role on the political level. We can also see internationally a very high dynamic movement. You can see here the different hydrogen roadmaps worldwide. Daily we get new hydrogen roadmaps. You can see a high concentration in Europe, where we have the European hydrogen roadmap, but also individual European countries have their own hydrogen roadmaps, and including North America and in the Asian region, large activities. It's also interesting to see the individual drivers. The Japanese have started again in the Asian region, and its focus is on clean air, environmental protection, while in the African countries and in the lesser developed countries, there are social drivers that play a role. Social stability, it's about welfare, increasing standard of living, but also establishing long-term partnerships. And then in the industrial countries where we have economic drivers, they play a big role. It's about economic growth, it's about industrial policy, industrial safety and independence, and energy independence, and also import and export of energy depending on the countries. Hydrogen is also to play a role when it comes to the effectiveness. And so this creates a lot of chances, especially for technology export from Europe, but also you can see that there is a very strong international innovation competition. It's not only a competition, but a race for market entry. And this is a new aspect when it comes to hydrogen technology. And on the political level, it's important to create a framework conditions in such a way that hydrogen can become a success story, not a failure. And so we also have a look a little bit more in detail on the European hydrogen strategy from the 8th of July 2020 foresees that in the first phase from 2020 to 24, it relies on the installation of at least 6 gigawatts of renewable hydrogen electrolyzers in the EU. And in the second phase, in 2024 until 2030, comes the installation of at least 40 gigawatts of renewable hydrogen electrolyzers. That means these are the goals for the expansion that have been set. And then you can see in the strategy that the creation of a value creation of a value creation strategy. There is an indirect effect on workplaces that on the creation of jobs of 1 million until 2030, and estimations that you can see at the bottom, 24% of global energy demand until 2050 could be covered by clean hydrogen. That means about 630 billion euros. And what also you can see in this picture is the greenhouse gas reduction by 560 million tons, and also long-term until 2050 in Europe, 5.4 million jobs. So there's a positive outlook, but when it comes to the implementation of the hydrogen strategy, but you can also read that until now, the renewable and CO2 hydrogen hasn't become competitive yet. And therefore, I would like to also have a look at the cost with you. How much does it cost green hydrogen today? These are some figures from the Lighthouse Project Power to Gas in Baden-Württemberg, and these are hydrogen power stations of 1 to 5 megawatts, and the electrolyzer is on the side of the hydrogen plant station, so there wouldn't be any additional energy supply. But you can see also at the side here the according parameters for to show you on how to read this diagram, meaning electricity cost per kilowatt hour, and these are then operated with 2,000 full load cost, and so you would come to about 11 euro per kilogram hydrogen, and it will be produced from natural gas, and then it would be about 2 euros per kilo. And this was the price at the time when the natural gas price wasn't as high as it is today. But we can also look at the application in this Lighthouse project. You can see in green this benchmark area of natural gas. This is what the price would be from natural gas production. So 25 euros per ton. This is quite a lot higher at the moment, meaning this would go slightly up. And the blue area, this is where hydrogen is being sold at the petrol stations at the moment, at the refueling stations. And you can see also hydrogen generation in the Lighthouse project with an annual production of 7,000 to 8,000 hours can be done in an economic area, and in an area where hydrogen could be compared at fuel cell cost technologies. And if you look at the other renewable technologies, you can see that with offshore wind farms, you have you come very close to this benchmark of the fuel cell mobility, and the same goes for wind turbines on land. You can get close to this value, but it's not a long-term economic production. And with photovoltaics, you're quite far away from it. But I would like to also point out that with the this is the today's numbers would be about 1 megawatt. If we look at the future, you can see also that we need a clear scaling when it comes to electrolysis. And with about 100 megawatts electrically, then you can see effects that make the cost much more affordable.
And you can see that with almost all the different renewable production techniques like wind power, onshore, offshore, hydroelectric power, we can reach the region of natural gas. And in particular, when we have a combination of production facilities, for example, if we allow photovoltaic electricity as well as wind offshore electricity to be purchased by a power purchase agreement for the electrolysis plant, then we can make sure that we have an economical operation similar to natural gas in a location like Germany. So this means that we are on a good track to come to a level where we have a cost parity with a fossil hydrogen. However, this scaling path needs to be continued until 2030, either in the economic hydrogen roadmap or the national roadmap in Germany. Both lay it out because Germany's objective is to reach 5 gigawatt electrolysis by 2030. And this means that we have certain revenue potential involved, or might be included, up to 4.5 billion euros in Germany and 35 billion euros in Europe. And you can see on the right-hand side that this is the possible path for electrolysis worldwide, how it might develop. And in very ambitious scenarios, we even see it go even further. And of course, this means that we have a certain degree of value added potential. However, the biggest challenge is the technological scaling and also the series production. Both are prerequisites so that these cost reductions can be achieved for the electrolysis technology. Let's take a look at Germany, and the German hydrogen strategy, as I've just shown, would like to install 5,000 megawatts in terms of capacity by 2030. And this means building up 20 terawatt hours of electricity. And so the share of green hydrogen is supposed to rise to 20% in the market. And of course, this also involves large investments. The future package of the Coalition Committee of June 3rd, 2020 provides for a further 7 billion euros to be made available for the market ramp up of hydrogen technologies in Germany, and further 2 billion euros for international partnerships. And the hydrogen strategy also includes certain measures, and very many projects have already been launched. Also at the European level, there are some IPCEI projects that have been launched, so projects with a common interest. And there we have special regulations in terms of funding or support, financial support for companies so that they can more easily apply for funding. So a lot is actually happening at the European and the German level. But Germany actually also wants to be #1 in the world of hydrogen technologies. And Peter Altmaier actually said that when he announced the hydrogen strategy of Germany. Within the hydrogen strategy, different aspects have been announced. For example, the minimum share of renewable energy in the final energy consumption of the transport sector in 2030 is to be increased significantly beyond the EU requirements, at least 14%. And this has already been implemented in the amendment law on the greenhouse gas reduction quota. And the renewable share is supposed to reach 25%, or the reduction of greenhouse gases, rather, 25%. And also the blending quota for synthetic fuels in the aviation fuel has also been implemented. It's supposed to reach 2% by 2030 and also increase by 0.5% till the year 2025, and 2028, 1% and 2% by the year 2030. 2030 or in the year 2030. So this has already been implemented in the legislative framework in Germany. So the planned amount of hydrogen from electrolysis, as what I've already mentioned. And when it comes to electricity or electrically produced jet fuel, we also have some figures here, and some of you might have heard that in Werte, we have the first synthetic kerosene that is being produced in a plant there, and the electrolyzer in Werte has made available hydrogen, and this carbon dioxide comes from biomass plant on the ground and also from the air in part. And there, for the first time, synthetic kerosene or jet fuel could be synthesized, which was purchased by the German Lufthansa. But of course, at first, these are only small volumes, but you can see that the technology development is supposed to be fostered and promoted as also laid out in the hydrogen strategy. And the last aspect I would like to pick up is that the cooperation with partner countries along the whole value chain is supposed to be promoted. So for German companies, a platform for their positioning on the foreign markets is to be created, and the German government also cooperates with or works on partnerships, technology partnerships. There are different kind of projects where the German government is involved, and one, for example, of the Academy of Sciences and the Federal Association of the German Industry. They are involved in the project HySupply together with Australia, but there's also another project from the Development Ministry in Morocco and in other African countries. So this means that the strategy is being implemented relatively quickly. So what does this mean along the value-added chain for German companies? So I picked up the example of Baden-Württemberg, and because we have made our independent calculations here, and the global demand in terms of electrolysis and synthetic fuel, we can develop certain scenarios. What does this mean for electrolysis and also for synthesis plants? What do we need and what kind of revenue potentials could be generated for the economy in Baden-Württemberg, for example, or also for the German economy, or also for the European economy? And for Baden-Württemberg, we can say that the revenue potential could develop as follows. By 2030, between 2,400 and 22,500 jobs could be created, always dependent on the scenario, and between 41 and 2050, between 8,400 and 50,300 jobs. And you might know that Baden-Württemberg is highly dependent on the automotive industry, and they can see that the more than 50,000 jobs, of course, could not cover for all the jobs in the automotive industry or could replace them, but at least here we could create future-oriented jobs for parts of these jobs. How did we come up with the calculations? So we have the technology components that you need for electrolysis, the electrolysis block, for example, the cooling system, pressure boosting system, enclosure, and others. This all belongs to electrolysis plants. And then we transferred this to the respective economic segments or industries that produce them. And for example, it includes 26% machine mechanical engineering, 10% from the rubber and plastic products, et cetera. And then we also took a look at the economic sectors in Baden-Württemberg. And if you then take a look at this pie chart, you can see that a large part of the industries that we need for this system is available in Baden-Württemberg. And so far we see quite good opportunities, and this can also be transferred to the national level. So this brings us to the first question round. Well, take a deep breath. Of course, you will be given the slides later. So if you have questions in terms of individual slides, and I've seen that there were questions for slide 10, etc., you will be provided with the slides afterwards, after the event. So Ms. Schmidt, thank you very much. So far, I think we've already seen in terms of hydrogen, I mean, there's a lot going on. It's about billions at the moment that are being distributed for research and others. And in order to have a quick market ramp up, and we do see that hydrogen is not only a climate or political project, it's also an industry-wide project. It's about competition for distribution markets and also purchasing markets. And you have shown that Germany, with a strong mechanical engineering market, is quite a good place, because the engineers are those who have to build the plant. So we are quite in a good position in Germany. However, where we are not that well positioned, because we are very small and densely populated, is the production of green hydrogen, because we only have limited space where we could produce solar or wind energy, and in order to put this into the electrolyzers. So hydrogen and its derivatives, and in order to produce them in a green way, leads to the question of imports. Of course, we already touched upon this yesterday, but as the question is coming up again today, I would like to ask you to comment this. The question is, put differently, maybe you can talk about the hydrogen strategies. What do the hydrogen strategies say about imports? Will there be any certifications or standards that will be set, or are there any obligations to prove where the hydrogen comes from, how it was produced, that the production did not lead to hampering the energy transition in those countries, or that water has been taken away from the population on the ground? So can you give us more insights in terms of the criterion of ecological sustainability? Well, as far as I can see it, this is not yet explicitly mentioned in the strategies, but for within Europe, we have not yet finally laid out definitions. So green hydrogen has not yet been defined at the European level, and I will talk about this in a moment, how the current state is and what the debate looks like at the moment. And of course, and the same requirements will apply to imports as apply to Europe as a whole in the future. So renewable electricity that is being produced in a country should not be used. Additional plants should be built in order to produce hydrogen that is being considered green here. And the argument that you just brought up is that the energy transitions in the respective countries might be hampered. This, of course, needs to be avoided. So this is actually a very important factor. And this is something that the EU needs to take into account, also when it comes to energy partnerships, which are funded with a lot of money. And it's my perception that it's always on the agenda, that we do not see a revival of colonialism, but that we really have a partnership at a level playing field with our partners, that the countries can also benefit from the changes that we expect from them, that they can benefit from the generation of renewable electricity in their countries. And that water, for example, is utilized in a way that the population on the ground also benefits when it comes to desalination, for example, of seawater, that this does not increase the pressure on the population on the ground. Of course, these are also issues that are present in the discussions, even though there are no finalized certifications yet, but it is a very important topic. And in terms of the amounts, the volumes that need to be imported, the strategies also do not say anything as far as I know. So first of all, the strategies focus on Europe or on Germany and the amounts that need to be generated here. But if we keep in mind the 20 terawatt electricity that are being needed for the generation, and we have a electricity consumption of 6 terawatts in Germany alone. So this shows you that it's not very much. So it's not a huge amount of hydrogen that's being produced here. This is too little and not yet sufficient for the large transition or climate protection measures in the areas where hydrogen is supposed to be used. So this cannot be done without any additional imports, but I will talk about this in more detail in the second part. So I will talk about hydrogen transport, for example, which is also an unsolved question yet. There have also been questions in terms of Norwegian pipelines and hydrogen. So what do you think about that? But you might be able to answer it in the second part. I would like to remind the participants, please write questions into the Q&A section. And if it's more complicated, and if you would like to raise it directly, you can actually join us via camera and microphone. Here we have a question with V or no, not a question. I'll just continue. We just talked about the other countries, the additionally needed green electricity, and also the water demand. There was also a question with regard to the water. How much water do we need? What does happen to the water after electrolysis? Is this a good water or whatever? Well, the raw material water that we need and that we should take care of. Well, for 1 kilogram hydrogen, we need 9 liters of water. It sounds quite a lot at the moment, but if you make calculations, it's not that dramatic in Germany, but of course in countries that are already suffering from water scarcity, this is definitely a problem. For the electrolysis, you need very clean water. This means that you have to process the water. And of course, you can also desalinate seawater at the beginning of the whole process, but you need very pure, very clean water. But you can also recover the water in the course of the process. Of course, there is a loss of water, but you can also recover water in order to have a good implementation and split up of water to hydrogen and oxygen. But it would be good, for example, to also make use of the oxygen in large electrolysis plants. It's quite a lot of oxygen. Oxygen might sound positive, but in large plants with a high volume of oxygen, you cannot simply emit it into the atmosphere because then it becomes toxic. So this means that you also have to develop or design an oxygen concept. And it would be good if the oxygen could be used on the ground for specific use cases or applications. And this is also something that people are working on, that we have a good value added chain here. And in terms of water, from my point of view, these kinds of concepts have to be designed in a way so that they produce too much water, so that there is additional water available on the ground for agriculture or the population. That, I mean, what I'm saying is that we do not only desalinate water for the electrolysis process, but that also the population on the ground can benefit from the whole process in order to have a holistic concept. And what might also be interesting is when you think of synthetic fuels, not only hydrogen in the production, because it's attractive when it comes to the transportation system, you need carbon dioxide. And when you take carbon dioxide from the air via direct air capture, it usually also produces water. So this means that we could have a synergy effect, and we could not only capture the carbon dioxide, but also produce water here. So of course, the issue of water always needs to be treated in ways so that everyone on the ground benefits from it, and not only the people who are taking care of the electrolysis process. But usually we have quite a good implementation process without large losses in the electrolysis process. But of course, the water is also split up into hydrogen and oxygen, and some water is, of course, lost here. Well, I think it's quite normal. It's similar to the chemical industry, where we have certain compounds and things are split up, and then we can make use of the different molecules. So we also have a question in terms of the electrolyzer. What are the, or one question is, in how far help or damage the currently very high electricity prices the growth in the electrolyzer segment? Question one. And this was actually a rather general question. And what are the bottleneck factors, or are there any bottleneck factors, or do we simply have to be patient? But maybe one remark to the energy prices: what kind of effect does it have? Well, in fact, we have different developments in terms of the energy prices. The current electricity prices are quite high, and this is rather an obstacle for the provision of renewable energy for electrolysis in Germany. Also, when it comes to power purchase agreements, and if you would be able to buy wind energy at a reasonable price, then this is not sufficient. In the current situation, where we have these high electricity prices, one could achieve higher prices at the stock exchange compared to using the electricity and the hydrogen production. So the high gas prices, in contrast, should actually have a positive effect, because hydrogen from natural gas is actually the competitor to green hydrogen. And if the natural gas price increases, then of course the price of hydrogen produced based on natural gas is increasing. And this is why the gap to green hydrogen is closing much more quickly. And also the carbon dioxide prices that have gone up in Europe add to that. This actually makes green hydrogen even more competitive, and also the electrolysis process. But we still face technological challenges when it comes to the upscaling. When it comes to electrolysis plants today, then they are built in a manufacturing operation, so to speak. So this means that we cannot produce these high volumes. So the challenge actually is to come to an industrialized serious production. And when it comes to electrolyzers, we basically talk about large, very large plants that could also handle materials that weigh tons, in particular when it comes to the upscaling of today's situation, where we have a 2-meter scale of an electrolysis block. And when we go from 1 megawatt to 20 megawatt, and this means that we have completely different dimensions and completely different weights. And this is why we need the respective technology on the side of the plant constructor, but also on the operating side as well. And we have to work on that. I mean, it's not yet a bottleneck, I wouldn't put it like that, but it's not yet there, and we have to develop it. And I earlier said or saw that there was also a question in terms of skilled workers. So as it's about the construction of chemical plants or mechanical engineering, of course, we will see a similar situation here. I mean, we see a lack of skilled workers in other areas, and this might also become an obstacle in our segment, but this is actually something that we are faced with in the whole energy transition, and this is something that we have to solve. We do not have sufficient skilled workers.
That's right. So we also had in our podcast that Mr. Stoll is doing in the chat. It's been a very big topic in the construction industry, chemical industry, automotive industry. The specialist should be recruited for the ecological transformation of the most important sectors. But one more question, Mrs. Schmidt, and then we can continue. There was a question by Mr. Ritzer. What sectors and application areas should have the high price priority when it comes to the usage of regenerated hydrogen? So are there any core figures for these allocations, or is it up to the market? Well, partly the German hydrogen strategy focuses on the industrial area, steel production, that would then have to implement new production processes with hydrogen. This is what I would have said as well, because in steel industry and also in the energy intensive industry, the challenges are for the long-term usage of the plants. And if there are new investments coming up, or reinvestments, and it has to be done with the new technology. So long-term, we would have a chance and opportunity to make these areas climate neutral. And they would also have to have a guarantee that they get the hydrogen they needed, otherwise they wouldn't make the investment. And that's the dilemma in the discussion about green or perhaps blue hydrogen that can be allowed for a transition period so that you can have the sufficient quantities that are needed. And that's also not excluded in the German hydrogen strategy, which focuses on green hydrogen, but they left it open at this part. But there is a discussion on the so-called merit order for hydrogen, so where you can make the most savings in regard to climate. So hydrogen is supposed to be used there first, and this would be in the energy intensive industry. But you can also argument differently. You can say we have relatively expensive hydrogen at the moment, so it should then be used in those areas where you have the highest ability or preparedness to pay. And so that would be the mobility sector, where there is the highest preparedness to pay. And well, you cannot really say it's black or white, but there are certainly different priorities on the political level as well. And I think, but for the biggest usage for climate protection would be in industry. So then we can continue with the second round. Then we have another round of questions, and perhaps you want to get involved. And I would also be happy to see some voices, hear voices and see some faces. And then let's continue. We had the topic import, we mentioned it already, and then the question comes up, long-term until 2050, where does the electricity, the hydrogen, and the synthetic energy sources come from? And if you look at transport, for example, the transportation sector, we need about 600 terawatt hours energy for the transport sector. And in future, this will increase due to the change to hydrogen, and we will have energy losses, and therefore we need 800 to 1,000 terawatt hours of energy in electric energy, and also we will move away from fossil energies and fossil sources, and then this roadmap for the chemical and steel industry will mean that we need about 1,000 terawatt hours by 2050, when solar is, not quite clear what the focus will be on. But when it comes to transport alone, and the industry, and we need about 2,000 terawatt hours, and in 2050 and 2019 we produced 574, and 235 of those came from renewables. So if you look at the energy in demand and heat supply from renewable electricity, you need the 10 times the amount that we have today. So whether we can achieve it, well, that's for you to answer. But we all know that in the past years we had a lot of difficulties to continue to increase the share of renewables. It was a very slow development. We had a lot of problems and a lot of difficulties to extend it for the future, so that the entire supply with green hydrogen could be provided for the domestic use. And so we don't see it. Therefore, well, we seem to be relying on imports in future also for economic reasons, because in other countries hydrogen can be produced much more cost effectively. And for which cost, this is what the DNA has, the IEA has given an overview. It's a combined picture from wind energy and photovoltaics, wherever it can be produced. And you can see here, perhaps below $1.6 per kilogram hydrogen. There are only very few reasons, and whoever knows the geography, then you can see that it's in the area of the Himalayas. And but of course, it will be very difficult to build up these plants. So this area is probably not very viable. But also in Chile and other areas in South America, you have very cost-effective options for green hydrogen. There are also some first pilot projects when it comes to green methanol. And yeah, Porsche has been very active in this area to produce synthetic fuels for the Porsche 911 that is not meant to be electrified. So so you can see here a lot of good potential, and there are a lot of countries here that can produce the natural gas at 2.2 to 2.4 dollars with the hydrogen production with natural gas. So you can see that there are some opportunities to produce cost-effective hydrogen and provide it. But the trade routes are lacking, and for this we have international demand for hydrogen, but the hydrogen is being produced on site, and there are no international networks for the transport or infrastructure. So therefore the question arises, how can you best transport the green hydrogen? What infrastructures are needed? And so there, the example of Porsche from Chile is certainly one that can be used, and to produce synthetic fuels, and then use the existing transport trade routes and transport this. This is certainly one opportunity, but also this contains the opportunity for Germany, once you have the technological leadership, but also for Europe, to use the electrolysis technology and export it to the respective sites, and then import the hydrogen. And then hopefully both sides will benefit from it and have their own value creation. Let's come back to the question of the transportation options. If looking at 2030, how can hydrogen be transported to Germany? Theoretically, there are about 5 options. You can liquefy the hydrogen and transport it via vessel. You can have a compressed hydrogen in a pipeline. You can have liquid organic hydrogen and a liquid hydrogen, organic hydrogen carrier transport by vessel or pipeline. And this is similar to transporting diesel, for example. And then you can also synthesize it with and produce ammonia and produce it by ship, as it's being done today with ammonia also for the fertilizer industry. And also the 5th point, you can also have an on-site transformation to power to liquid hydrogen and then use the crude oil pipelines for it. And with the last option, with the methanol or CO2 mix, then there would be a lot of energetic losses, and therefore the methanol would be used as a green platform chemical, or use or where you have no other options, for example, in aviation, and you wouldn't have hydrogen transport, but the product transport with ammonia. Both is possible. Either you can re-crack it and have hydrogen again, or use it directly as a chemical, and then it would be green and could be helping industry in decarbonization. But the precondition is that for all the transport options, there is still development need when it comes to liquid hydrogen. There are no vessels, there are no ships that can transport it yet. There's one prototype that is transporting between Australia and Japan, but it's a small vessel and there aren't any bigger ones. And so the announcement by the shipping companies from Korea and Japan who want to produce 4 big transport vessels until 2030 for hydrogen transportation. But that's not the option for transporting hydrogen to Germany. When it comes to high pipeline transportation, we have certain experiences with pipelines. There is one in the Ruhr Valley that's about 230 kilometers long, in operation since 1940, but it's a small product pipeline, not compatible with the large transportation pipelines. We have to gain experiences first. LOHC, it's unclear on how it will be treated to transport it in the respective vessels. But the biggest question here is when it comes to dehydration of hydrogen, then we don't have the large-scale technologies to do it today. And the same goes for the ammonia cracker. We don't really have a large technological option. And so meaning the only usable path today would be using green ammonia hydrogen directly in the industry, because there are a lot of questions that still have to be clarified, and also CO2 cracking from air has to be, well, it's still partly implemented in the industry, but not on a large scale. So it's not looking that good for the possible import option in 2030, but we have to develop it accordingly so that after 2030 we have the transport infrastructure available. And I mentioned already that when it comes to the legal framework, it doesn't exist yet on a European level. It's being developed at the moment in the framework of a delegated legal act, and for a process from having electricity from the network. It's about 3 points. One is the simultaneously for hydrogen and electric production. It means it should be ensured that the electricity production unit, which the producer has a bilateral contract to purchase renewable electricity, correlates temporarily and geographically with the fuel production. For example, renewable fuel of non-biogenic origin should not be counted as fully renewable if they are produced at a time when the contracted renewable electricity production unit is not producing electricity. So this simultaneously is very important here, and so that the renewable hydrogen can be declared as green. And a second point, a second criteria is that there is no network bottleneck between the electricity and hydrogen production. So it correlates with the other quote. So therefore, the fuel, it should be ensured that the electricity production unit with the producer is bilateral contract for the purchase of renewable electricity, and it should be if the hydrogen production should not increase the network bottlenecks. And then the third is the additionality of the renewable electricity production. So it should be an element of additionality. There should be meaning that the fuel producer contributes additionally to the use of renewable sources or to their financing. And this should also go for the import of hydrogen to Europe. And accordingly, at the moment, the framework conditions are being discussed. Now we come to these individual criteria because they can lead also to a situation where the ramp up of green hydrogen is being hindered because the criteria that there's no network bottleneck between electricity and hydrogen production means that it can also limit the electricity supply, because on a basis, you can see the borders here, due to long-term structural bottlenecks. We have seen that there can be network bottlenecks between the individual countries. In Germany, we don't have any at the moment, but in Germany also the north-south bottlenecks will have to be removed because otherwise there will be problems here as well. But that means if you take it that you do, once you have bottlenecks, there will be no electricity supply from external sources, for example, from Spain, but that wouldn't be admissible according to the production of green hydrogen, and it would make also green hydrogen a lot more expensive, and possibly then lower the production. When it comes to simultaneous aspects, it would be possible to guarantee it via an electricity supply contract. It's already possible today when you have no direct contract with the electricity producer, but pool the contracts and therefore have a basic supply that is being secured. And when it comes to, for example, from photovoltaic energy offshore, and the basic supply would be possible for the electricity customers. but this is in connection with the additionality criteria of renewable electricity production, meaning what does it mean, additionality, and can it be measured? And when it comes to the right side here, you can see the starting point of renewable energy in Germany on the left. When it comes to the international figures, and this is where you need, for example, the Agora that was quoted in Agora. You need a lot of extension, and the question is what needs to be built in addition, and renewable electricity generation plants, and that do you need plants that don't need any subsidies, or, for example, that those that come to the end of their production time due to their plannable sales, can they be continued, or well, these are all questions that are still open and are in direct connection with the simultaneity.
Oh, Rita's very interesting. I've almost finished it. Well, there's so many questions, and officially we only have 9 minutes left, so maybe we can rush through the red criteria. Well, I'm finished soon. It's about the question whether simultaneity and additionality are being fulfilled at the same time. And this can only be done when hydropower and photovoltaic are needed for continuous operation and received at the same time. And this is very important for the market ramp up for hydrogen at the moment. And in Germany, wind parks, offshore wind parks, and photovoltaic, or onshore wind parks, and offshore and photovoltaic could be used. Electricity without hydroelectric power cannot be purchased here or used here. So this means that it's difficult to bring the simultaneity and additionality in line. And this means that hydrogen might become more expensive, and we'll have to see what the EU is going to do here. In order to enable Europe to achieve an international leading position in the innovation competition for green hydrogen and synthetic fuels, the regulations must be very flexible and easy to comply with, especially in the market entry phase and the beginning of market ramp-up phase. Once a certain market dynamic has been reached, the requirements can be increased in order to demand stronger contributions to system stabilization. So the market entry can be handled quite easily. According to the hydrogen strategy, it makes up only 1.5% of the electricity generation within the EU. So this means that we do not see such a large impact on the electricity grid so far, so it's easier to design that. But when it comes to the market ramp up, we'll have to wait and see, because 40 gigawatt electrolysis capacity by 2030 already amounts to 10% of the European electricity consumption, and there we need stricter regulations. And so far, a lot is still in flux. By the end of the year, this delegated legal act is supposed to be passed. So please keep an eye on what the EU is deciding here. And like yesterday, I would like to make this little advertising here for the this event of the FVEE. So if you would like to learn more, you can have 2 days with lots of information on hydrogen and climate neutrality, from research to practical application. If you like, we can meet there again. And now we come to the second question time in order to give you the opportunity to ask questions. Ms. Schmidt, maybe you can stay a little longer. Of course, I'm happy to stay longer. Jo Kunze asked a question and he would like to join us via video. Joe Kunze, please.
Kunze wird jetzt wahrscheinlich aufgefordert vom Host, sein
Joe
Video oder
Kunze might be asked by the host to switch on the video and the sound. It would be great if you could do that
damit die Frage gestellt werden kann.
so that you can raise your question here.
Jetzt müsste ich zu hören sein auch, ne?
Can you hear me now?
Wunderbar.
Yes, great.
Also, ich hatte die Frage,
Well, my question is, I mean, we've heard a lot about the world, Europe and Germany, but when I go to my local politicians, when do you think it might make sense for me to apply for an electrolysis unit in addition to the local photovoltaic installations in order to provide the local public transport with hydrogen? Or would you say that it doesn't make much sense at the municipal level because the simultaneity and additionality aspects are difficult to reach, and we are still at very low level in terms of production? And what would you say? Well, in fact, I would say that you could start with it right away, because in particular in Germany, we have very many pilot projects, in particular at the local level. So from my point of view, it will also be the best way for the market ramp up via local initiatives where renewable hydrogen is being produced and also consumed at the local level, because you could see that it's very difficult to transport hydrogen. This is why the local hydrogen production will be a very important option by or until 2030. And it's very important that you bring together the consumers and the producers. I mean, if you plan for a hydrogen refueling station and have a logistics company on the ground that wants to transport the hydrogen, and if you have the respective consumers who are prepared to say to pay a little bit more, then you already have a finalized business model. So I would like to encourage you to not postpone it, but to try to bring together the different partners. And of course, it will still take enough time until you get all the permissions. This is also our experience. So please start right away and try to bring together the respective players. Then you will be successful. I think that the market ramp up will be achieved predominantly via local initiatives. And the electrolysis plants that are still at a very small level and not yet scaled up, they can contribute to it. Exactly, these are the units or the plants that you can already purchase. We still lack the bigger ones. And if you have an electrolysis plant that produces 7,000 hours, then of course it's quite good. And in Wien, which I showed you, we are still faced with the challenge to find the respective consumers on the ground in order to develop that further. And so far it would be very good as soon as you have the respective consumers or the respective demand, you can implement it. Here we have a question from a woman in the audience who asks, where can we find a list of the electrolyzer manufacturers? So my question is just for our orientation, it's not meant to be an advertising. So where are the names of electrolyzer producers, and is there a list of these manufacturers out there? As far as I know, there are 10 electrolyzer producers, for electrolyzers between 1 to 10 megawatts. I think I already included it yesterday in the presentation. So should you be sent the presentation, you should be able to find it. McPhee, for example, is one German company who offers electrolyzers, but I cannot make any advertisements here. So I'm a bit hesitant to mention names, but it should be included in my presentation. And should that not be the case, I could send you the slide afterwards. Mr. Shaw already advertises the Faktenböll facts on hydrogen that will be published at the end of October. And there we also included the largest PEM plants.
Wo da die größten sind, davon sieht man auch, wer das gebaut hat.
And they can also see who built them. And another question is, how can the electrolyzers deal with the fluctuations or the intermittent electricity generated by renewables? Well, especially the PEM technology can deal with it extremely well, so they can react in the millisecond range, but also the alkali electrolysis can be run in a profile that can deal with the intermittent electricity generation by renewables. So it is possible. There are no technical obstacles that would prevent you from doing that. Of course, electrolyzers like to produce in a continuous way, but the technology can also deal with fluctuations there. And the electrolysis, of course, can also contribute to the stabilization of the power grid in the future. Electrolysis can also make available positive and negative performances. And of course, or controlled services. Of course, this all depends on the business model that you are pursuing, but the electrolysis, of course, can support the power grid of the future. I would like to mention two blocks or groups of questions. One refers to the exporting countries, and the other group of questions refers to the corporations in terms of the technology developments. First of all, on the exporting countries. So Jens Kutscher asked whether oil and gas-rich countries like Algeria, Libya, Saudi Arabia, or the United Arab Emirates an advantage when it comes to the production of green hydrogen because they have respective energy infrastructure or also know-how, or is their advantage simply that they have a high availability of wind and solar energy? And another question from Knapp Martin, why should hydrogen be transported to the classical industrialized countries? Can we build up the industry where the hydrogen can be produced in a cost-efficient way? Then the skilled workers would actually go from north to south. Well, I would like to answer the second question first. Of course, this is not desired from a political point of view, because this would mean that we would see a deindustrialization in Germany if we no longer had a steel industry and others. Then, of course, from a political point of view, this is not a scenario that is being desired or we should strive for. But you are right. I mean, the discussions are ongoing, especially in the context of green steel, whether at least the raw steel production should actually take place where green hydrogen is available in abundance, and only the further manufacturing should take place in the industrialized countries. But from a political point of view, this is actually not an option to demand this. And in terms of the countries that were mentioned here, of course, they might benefit if they had the respective infrastructures that could be used here. But of course, they have a lot of space that can be used for photovoltaic and wind energy generation, which also is beneficial for them. But when the infrastructure is already available, then of course you can make available the respective volumes much more quickly than countries that have not yet built up the respective infrastructure. And so far, of course, these countries have a political interest. I mean, they know that their fossil fuel reserves or resources are endless and they will not benefit from it eternally. So they are looking for new business fields. And they also have the respective funds in order to invest in the build up of hydrogen production, for example. So this might also be an economic concept post oil, so to speak, that they might pursue. And then there was the question from Katja Levy. Can you tell us in how far the green hydrogen technology has been developed in China? So first question. And secondly,
nur national gearbeitet oder gibt es auch
are there only national or also international corporations for the development of green hydrogen? Well, on the first question, I'm not exactly sure, but I do know that in China, the 5-year plan lays out 100 gigawatt target. And when you look at the goals for other segments in the 5-year plan, then of course you can imagine that the Chinese are intensively working on reaching this target. And the second question referred to the international cooperation. Okay, so I already brought up the so-called IPCEI projects. So the projects with a special common interest in Europe, which also includes and fosters the cooperation of different European countries in the context of hydrogen production. So there are different projects in Europe in order to promote the hydrogen generation. And I also mentioned HySupply earlier. This is a project in cooperation with Australia. So there is an international cooperation. And the idea here is, for example, to jointly advance this technology, and Germany might become a technology exporter and a hydrogen importer, for example. The Australian side as well as the German side are very committed here, also in the exchange and cooperation. And this is just one example. There are also other activities out there that stand for the international cooperation. So it looks as if the corporations increase on the international hydrogen market. And of course, we also have the H2 Global, which is a project supported by the federal government, which also supports hydrogen projects in other countries. And of course, the partner countries benefit from it because they can actually achieve the respective prices which are higher for green hydrogen. So a lot is being done. Well, I think we have reached the end of our introduction to hydrogen. Thank you very much, Ms. Schmidt, and thank you very much for all of you who have asked questions here. Unfortunately, we could not take every question. Some questions might be answered or can be raised again in the event that Ms. Schmidt has mentioned. And Mr. Stoll has just posted the link. It's at the Umweltforum Berlin, Environmental Forum Berlin. And we at the Heinrich Böll Foundation, we have also produced and published materials on hydrogen, and there will be more in the near future. And also the Agora Energiewende, energy transition, and the Umweltbundesamt in Germany, the Federal Environmental Agency. So that much for our introduction. So please stay with us. I've got another poll, another survey. This helps us to improve our seminars here and our events. So please go through the survey. It's just 3 different questions. Did you attend both parts of this webinar? And how likely would you recommend this webinar to a friend or a colleague?
Und
And the third question is, how satisfied were you with this webinar? Would you say very super satisfied, dissatisfied, neutral, or satisfied?
das noch mal kurz uns sagen könnten als kleines
So
Feedback.
this would be great as a feedback. And if you would like to comment on the webinar further, you can write an email to stoll@böll.de. This is also the contact information that you got in the email.
Wie das Zeugnis ausfällt.
And this is actually the result of our little survey, of our little poll.
Ein Großteil hat
So,
beiden Webinaren.
Many of you have participated in both webinars, and many of you would recommend it.
Auch diese Aufzeichnung noch
Well, you could also recommend your friends to watch the recording of this event.
Ja, also es waren auf jeden Fall, sind mehr Leute irgendwie
And
satisfied.
obviously more people are satisfied than not. It was a little bit confusing maybe here. So the answers are in the wrong order. So thank you very much, Ms. Schmidt, for staying longer. Thank you very much for everyone involved here, for the organization and also the interpreters. Thank you. And see you next time at another introductory webinar at the Heinrich Böll Foundation. Bye-bye.